I want to show you some images that have a very clear shape design through light and dark. I think these demonstrate the idea of simplicity in value. When I was learning how to paint portraits and people, I studied a lot of these kinds of references, and I learned how to simplify based on these kind of shapes. I learned like a lot of shorthands for painting people and using shapes to imply information. Like, if we were to take this head, you I've learned this kind of pattern in these heads happening all the time. You see how like effective these shapes are at describing like a head, right? And this is just two values, but like these shapes are so common in painting and like just portraiture that studying these simplified images allows you to see the patterns in faces. And this one is perhaps the most common one that I've seen. Like I see this one in comic art all the time, and it's the classic sort of like classic light from above, right? I'm sure you've seen this kind of trope like a million times, and these are things that I pay attention to when I'm studying faces or really anything. But since most of us will be painting a lot of faces, probably, it's really important to simplify these shapes into like distinct value groups, so that we can, when we paint from imagination or making our own paintings, we can really use these shapes. We can just deploy them like whenever we need to, and quickly just get like a head out just like this, like. See how common this is? Like, you see how effective this is? Just sort of having these graphical shapes of light and dark. It just makes everything feel much more approachable. It's like I don't really think about necessarily all of these anatomies all that much, but what I focus on is sort of the shape. These big masses of shape and how they describe the form that we see. And this I would just simplify all of this into one value if I were to do a study of this. Yeah, and even if I'm not doing a study, I would do this in my paintings as well, right? Because it makes the image have much more clarity to them. This one as well. This one has like light and dark. You get a little triangle shape here, and then you have a light from this way, right? So I would just simplify this into a triangle as well. And all this information, all this pattern for in this stage, when we're looking at value, we can just look past all the details over here, right? And just simplify everything into like dark and light. Maybe here you can have a third value, like a midtone. Right? And this is how I go about studying a lot of the times. See this right here, that shape, it describes the head so well. It doesn't take much. You have all this whole head is being carried by just a few darks, right? Simplicity, right? See how effective that is? So this is what I want people to understand, is that when it comes to value design and painting, you really got to think just first light and dark pattern, two value essentially, just two values. And then as you are painting, you can add more, but the two value initial read, it's quite important. And this also simplify things too. It helps you remember the shapes better too when you're painting. Because if you have so many values to worry about, you probably have a hard time remembering certain shorthands, right? For example, if I just only think about dark and light, kind of like a marker, sketch or something, right? Then that's all the shapes I have to think about. I can, I just need to remember what the dark shapes are when I'm painting, right? And if I'm doing like a head from imagination, I remember that these shapes are something like this, some kind of triangular shape. Right? And this is made easy because I only think in two values. You know? And I don't even necessarily construct. Of course, understanding the head is really good for anatomy knowledge, but when it comes to studying shapes, I just focus on the shapes. I focus on the positive shapes and the negative shapes, right? And this is a negative shape, like this. I mean, it depends how you look at it, but this is a positive shape. This is a. You see how this is a head, and it reads like a head instantly. And this guy right here, for example, is just a silhouette. He's got a hat, but the silhouette is all it really takes for that character to read. Even this head, this face in the front, you know, I would just look at the dark and light. So you have light and then dark, all this. I would just, group. And here it's a midtone. Here we have light. So see how simple that is when I flatten these area out, these areas become flat shapes, and but that reads so clear, like that still reads so clear. And this is how we want to paint, like this face initially looked quite perhaps scary to approach it, but when we simplify it like this, it's this looks much more approachable and doable. And we can even take out these light shapes. We can literally just do like two values again, right? Like we can just do light and dark. We can just, and this still works really well, right? So this is like what I recommend. And look at the triangle shapes in these folds. We're gonna get into these shapes a lot more in future lessons, but right now let's just look at like how these shapes are mostly triangular. And even these little shapes are triangular. So I think triangle is quite a common shape that happens. This happens a lot in nature. Triangle shapes. We have triangle shapes here as well, right? A lot of triangles, right? So yeah, look for triangle shapes because they're so common. And even this, if we were to take this negative shape here, well, this is really a positive shape, but let's take this light shape, and you see how it's a triangle. Here is it's also some kind of a triangle, but with more sides, kind of like a crystal shape, another triangle shape, right? You can simplify this into a triangle shape as well. So yes, look for triangle shapes a lot. They happen all the time. And if I was doing this study, for example, I would simply just group all of this into one, including the head, right? And later, if I want to add subtle value details or value information, I could do that, but they're very subtle, you know. So you notice how I'm using these shapes that I mentioned earlier here, right? Even though that's not exactly what I'm looking at, I am still using these shorthand shapes that I've learned through studies and observation to just make things more clear and much more simpler for me. You know, it's like I'm no longer copying, I'm just designing now with these shapes that I've learned over time. You know, and this is what I want you to also realize is that, you know, when we're looking from references, we're not really copying. You know, like at the end of the day, we want to learn shorthands that it's gonna be able to make us efficient, and you know, also design our own shapes for extra like appeal. And this is how someone might have their own quote unquote style, right? Because we have our own shapes that we like using, and we don't want to be a slave to the reference, you know, and we want to be able to change our reference in a way that is believable, but you know, believable, but also like unique to our own sort of like taste, you know. See how this looks different from that, but but you know, this was my reference, right? And they're not the same. You know, I don't want to like pixel by pixel copy every value here. You know, I want to sort of dissect this and see what is happening here with the information and values. It's almost like a reminder, right? And here, when I paint, I really want to design a bit more than copy. You know, of course, when you don't know how to design, yeah, then you are more reliant on the reference as a starting point. You have to copy a bit more. But as you study more phases like this and this, you'll learn how the structure of the head is, and you'll learn how to stylize and simplify these shapes for like that read, right? And you'll start to see patterns that happen in all portraits or faces. You can then just design your own face, like, you know, you can really design things from imagination. And this is how I think about imagination, is that imagination is really you noticing patterns through just thousands of studies. And then you can just take it out whenever you need to, you know, in your own work. No, like if I was painting like this hand, you know, like I know that this is just probably a triangle here, and I'll just put the triangle down, you know, and I'll build my hand off of that. Of course, knowing the structure is important, but also looking at how shapes interact, you know, with how shapes work with that structure, because we see in shapes, right? So understanding how these shapes sort of look like and sort of memorize them, you know, along with the structure is what's gonna get you where you want to go, basically. And this pants here, right? I would just group this into one value, just like this. I would take the average. You know, if I was doing like a three value study of this image, I would really just take this average value of this area and just make it into one value. Maybe if I have another actual value left, I can just you know, group these or something. And I would just really simplify this. You know, here I have a few like comic book panels, right? What they do really well is they really take the idea of, you know, simplifying values, because they have to work with black and white, right? And they work with that limitation means that they have to be really efficient and design everything in a way that is readable and, you know, appealing. So you see how these are just one value, two value images, and you have like this light on dark, and then and then switches, right? Switches to dark again on light, and then it goes back to light on dark again. So this figure here is light on dark, and then this is dark on light. So, you know, remember when we talked about checkerboarding? This is what they're doing. It's like, You know, they want to make this character read, but also this character read. So how do they make this character read here? They just simply put a, you know, dark background for this character to read, right? And that's like obviously by design, and this is how we want to think about our paintings. It's really no different. Here, you know, those face and head shapes we talked about earlier. Look how clear that is here, right? You know, you have the classic up light from above shot, you know, like lighting. And look at the shapes being created. It's always these shapes, you know, it's like these are so common that there's no way you don't notice that these shapes are common once you've studied just like a few of those images. You know, you'll really start to notice the pattern, right? And here, right, this, you know, this is just the same as this, the same trope of lighting kind, right? But notice how effective that is, you know? It's so this gives the illusion of a lot of information happening, but in reality it's just two values. You have a dark. If I were to just flatten everything in the shadow, this image will not be any weaker, really. It is still going to be a very strong image just because of the simplicity in value and shape. The shapes are just precise, and you know, they really carry everything along with values. Right? That does not lose sort of any strength. You know, this head here is just, again, it's quite simple. Triangle, 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 you know, and I can, if I'm studying this image, I can then note to myself, okay, I go triangle, triangle, you know, and triangle, right? Triangle. You know, so when I say the word triangle, that makes me sort of make a more conscious effort to make sure that it is a triangular shape when I'm putting it down. You know, it's sort of like I want to be more conscious of the shapes I'm making. I don't want shapes to be super ambiguous and sort of like you know, without like some kind of identity to them. I want shapes to have sort of identity on their own. You know, so I'm purposely making these shapes triangular like this.